And it's a dover ploy. I remember at the time, I was a big boy. I was the shliach in Los Angeles by Rabbi Shochet, was gesund stark. And he was not the kind of person who was into fabrengens and into drinking mashke and into dancing. He saw that as toyev avoyev v'choshech al pnei tehom. And one day on his own, he walks into the Beis Medrash, says, move aside the tables. He hired a band and paid. And the Anash came. We, the Bacham, naturally, were there already, and we danced. At the time, we didn't fully understand what happened. Rabbi Chadukov told him to do it. Rabbi Chadukov was his uncle. That was the day. It was the beginning of the trial. It was 1986. It was Memvav. It was probably still 85, yeah? Beginning of Kislev, Memvav. The Rebbe broke the Parshas HaSfarim Yud Beis Tammuz the summer before. So those few months, Tammuz of Elul Tishrei Cheshvan, was what they call discovery. Ich verstehe die Sachen wie Ahon im Bnei Yodam. I don't understand anything about how the legal system works. Both sides had to collect evidence and present it to their opposition. The trial took 3 weeks, which is a very, very long time for a trial. It's a very long time. 3 weeks of collecting testimony till after Chanukah. And if you remember, the Rebbe was sensitive of the idea that the solution to Parshas HaSfarim is to do more Mivtzoyim Parshat. That Chanukah, the Shturim of Mivtzoyim, was incredibly strong because the Rebbe, the Kitrug is, in the words of the Rebbe from the following year, Agudas Chassidic Chabad is nish genug aktiv. Agudas Chassidic Chabad is not active enough. And the removal of the Kittel is to show that we're plenty active. So that Tishrei was a Shturim dik, that Kislev was a Shturim dik. The Rebbe verbringt Shabbos, Motzei Shabbos, Sunday night, Medachzach, at the end of Chanukah, in Memvav that year. This was the very beginning of the trial. And the lawyers were arguing still. And one of the arguments that the lawyers had is the idea of getting the Rebbe to testify. He should be deposed, like the Rebbetzin was deposed. And I have an interesting story which is not well known. I should really be mefashing this ma'aseh. They actually did depose the Rebbe Tzchaya Mushka for many hours. And I just saw the other day from Rabbi Krinsky's or Gesundsein how they weren't nice to her. They were trying to get her to slip up. And she stood her ground the whole time. But they wanted to depose the Rebbe. At the last moment it was cancelled. And the shmuel was, and do I know if this is true? I don't know if this is true, but this is what people are saying. That our lawyers Tanya that for the Rebbe's Gesundheit ist nicht. They say, Dr. Weiss now talks about the Rebbe's heart. And he says, why am I allowed to reveal the Rebbe's heart? Patient, the medical records are sealed, because the Rebbe gave permission to disclose his medical condition because they had to use it in court to argue that it's a psychotic for the Rebbe. The expression that he uses is hypertension. I don't know what hypertension means, but it's not a good thing. And the Rebbe is suffering from hypertension. Ubemela, it's not good for him to have to testify. We brought our medical argument and back and forth. So again, what we heard B'shaite was then, this is over 30 years ago, I guess this year it's 35 years exactly, that the Tzaddik Keneged brought in the Sichas that come out in 1 week. A Yiddish Sicha, a Hebrew Sicha, a Lakuta Sichas, a Misichas, a Maimir. And said, this is a sick man, I'm asking you, this is a sick cook. This is 1 week worth of production. So again, this is the story we heard at the time, that the judge asked, what does he have on these papers? This is his teachings, this is his philosophy, this is his opinion. About everything, yeah. About the books also. So he said, yes. So the judge said, why do you have to bring in him? Bring in his papers and we'll learn what he holds from his papers. In other words, it was a classic v'napechu. This is what we heard at the time. I don't know if this is true. Somebody in Shul told me yesterday that the judge said, you don't bring a melech into court. I don't think that happened. But this is, the guy's much younger than I am. He doesn't remember it from then. He heard it later. Schwarze judge, yeah, Goyish judge. sometimes the boys who are younger have a more accurate story than the people who remember it because they're getting it without the haze and the fog. But that's what happened. We were sitting in Los Angeles, and the shmua came that at the last moment, the Rebbe's deposition was cancelled. What I heard from Rabbi Shem Tov, this is not well known. I heard from him directly that the deposition had already been scheduled. It was supposed to be in the library, right here. Like the Rebbe was in the house. So the Rebbe said, we scheduled the deposition, let's have it. And the Rebbe went from 7:30 to the library, and then he had to go through the court. He had to go down the steps. And he sat with the two lawyers, our lawyers, this haste, Mr. Lewin, with the fated lawyer, Shestak, and Rabbi Remmel, and Yudel Chins, the five of them, and they verbringt. So the Rebbe sat down, and he sat back. The Rebbe always sat at the edge of his seat. The Rebbe sat back. He described it to me. The Rebbe was like, that's ruhig. Verbracht. I wish, I was in a Remmel Shem Tov's house for a Shabbos, and I heard a lot of wonderful things. This is one of the things he told me. It's so important to repeat it correctly. My recollection is, and unfortunately I don't trust my own zikaron, that the teuchen of the shmuas was verbringen, the besatten verbringt, was about the Indian from the Siyas, from the Rebbe. From the Rebbe, from the Siyas. I don't remember the product, but he told me that this happened, that since the deposition was scheduled, the Rebbe spent the time that he allotted for the deposition with the lawyers and with the Rebbe's shluchim who were doing this trial, the case, and he verbreitet about the Indian of Nesias, and I see from Klal. I mean, the whole point of it was that the Rebbe's argument was that the Rebbe is connected to the Chassidim are connected to the Rebbe, but male there's no hefsek. No, in the Niggler terms you say tzibur loy bottle. Communities don't die, people. And in the Hasidic sprach you say Zarei b'chayim, hu b'chayim. The Rebbe lives through and in and with the Chassidim. Ubemele, the idea of an estate being private and being able to be distributed is not ein laladas in such a maimed amatzit. And if I remember correctly, and I'm telling you straight that I'm not sure I remember correctly, the one chesed with I spent Shabbos, it would have been a weekday, but Alas Nekadir, but Shabbos you can't do that. But I remember this is what I think. But the Etzeminian that the deposition had already been scheduled, and that the Rebbe said we scheduled it. Let's do it, even though there was no actual deposition. And this was the Teichen Advarim. This is what he told me. Heard from him directly. But it's a serious yomtiv. It's a serious yomtiv means it's a big ness. It's a groishe ness. The idea that they wanted the Rebbe to testify. And the Rebbe is behind the whole thing, there's no question about it. And the Rebbe was prepared to testify. That's how the story goes. The Rebbe was prepared to testify. Yudel Krinsky at the beginning of he says it's not so easy to talk to the Rebbe in a non-respecting voice. But the Rebbe said to Yudel, I'm prepared to testify. And the Rebbe Krinsky said, Shumei from not. The Rebbe is not testifying. He became emotional. He worked with the Rebbe for 40 years, 35 years. But he told the Rebbe, absolutely not. The Rebbe said, I'll go and testify. And he said to the Rebbe, no, the Rebbe is not going to testify. And when he repeats the story, Yudel is not an emotional man. They gave out this week in the Kfar Chabad summaries of what ran on the marathon that the Shluchim had for, 150 hours of Fabrengen. So the Yudel's contribution, they put it up. And he told us this story. I remember him telling this story years ago, but how we told the Rebbe, no, the Rebbe is not going to testify. And this happened in Gimel Kislev. And it was a clarity of the situation. As Mahatzatan mit Rebbe. Anyway, it's Sunday, and Sunday we learn Tanya, and I don't like to be mevatel Tanya. Tanya I like to learn. Tanya I don't like to skip. So we're in Perek Tesvav, Rabbi, it's chapter 15. Perek Tesvav. Now, we're holding near the bottom of Daf Chafalef from an Aleph. Exactly where I'm holding is hard to say, because you can start from this line, you can start from the next line, you can start from the third line, but I'm going to set up today's limud. I'm going to introduce what we're going to be learning, and then we're going to learn exactly where we start is a bit equivocal, it's a bit grey. The Teuchen Advarim is that in this Perek Tezvov, the Alter Rebbe first of all very briefly separates Tzaddik from Bein. It's based on a pasuk in the Gemara. He separates Tzaddik from Bein. The Tzaddik is called Eved Hashem, and Bein is called Eved Elikim. Eved versus Oved, Havai versus Elikim. Then he puts Tzaddik aside, and he starts to talk two types of Beinani. One kind of Beinani is called Eved Elikim, and the second kind of Beinani is called Lei Avodah. And the Rebbe discusses Lei Avodah. We spent a class on each one of these. A whole Sunday in each one of these points. There's one person who's Lei Avodah B'Teva. He was born with a series of traits. Three, if you have all three together, Matmed B'Lebudah B'Tivei, Mitzunen B'Tivei, M'chusar Hergesh Hana B'Tivei, if you have all three of these traits together, so you could be a Beinani and never struggle. Maybe you take out Tzaddik. The Teretz is because the Tzaddik is not defined that he doesn't struggle with evil. A Tzaddik is defined by Avaya Simurai. He loves good and he hates evil. And this Bein doesn't love good, doesn't hate evil. He just guilty. He's cold. Another way to be a Bein Avada is handle. A person could have started out with a struggle. But at a certain point he reaches a Maimed of Matzav, he reaches a disposition of Lei Avodah. He's used to it, he's used to learning. He's used to being precise and disciplined in his involvements in Dvarim Gashmiyim, so he's not struggling and he's a Beinani. So last week's class started with a kasha. The Alter Rebbe doesn't ask the kasha, we ask the kasha. What's he supposed to do? First of all, between me, you, and the bookcase, we're all jealous of him. We wish we didn't have to fight for a Yetzer Hara. We wish, ben glatt und green und geschmack. We wish it wasn't such a hard struggle. We wish it wasn't such a big deal. And secondly, what's he supposed to do? No, the Eibishter made it easy for him. Either the Eibishter made it easy for him because he gave him certain tchunas on nefesh, or the Eibishter gave it easy to him because he acclimated himself, he got himself used to living in a certain way, and it's become what the Rabbi calls in the Tanya Teva Sheni, second niche. So the Alter Rebbe answered that the reason it's held against him is because there's a concept called Meya Kamaveres. 101 times, or 102 times. Well, like I told you last week, in Terek Lamed, you're going to have 200 times. There's no such thing as a person who could say, I don't have work. There's a person who could say that to be what I am, I don't have to work. But if I want to be more, I can work. And this is the time, the Beini that's Lei Avodah, where he is right now, Ba'asher Hu Sham, in his current condition, his Avodas Hashem is Nitam. It's not hard. It's not difficult for him to be misagay, to harav and to ton in Avodas Hashem. In other words, it's for him a relatively an easy affair. But if he goes beyond his normal, there's plenty of room for avodah. In other words, there's plenty of room for challenge and a need to motivate the challenge. In other words, if a person can serve the Eibishter and not have to excite himself in order to do so, it's called Lei Avodah. If a person can serve the Eibishter and you ask, why is he doing mitzvahs and not Avedas? Why is he not doing Avedas Rachmana Litzlan rather than yesterday Avedas? And the answer is because it's easy for him. And he has an Avativus. He's a Jew. There's a Pintel Yid. There's a Yiddish Neshama. So this Pintel Yid, this inner Jew that he possesses, in its hidden state, in its unmotivated state, is sufficient to help him maintain this level of pain. And that's called Lei Avodah. This is an idea which is tiny. It's a fascinating idea that the Eibishter gave us a teva. Right? The Eibishter gave us a teva. There's two tevas in Tanya. You're familiar? There's two tevas in Tanya. There's the teva of the nefesh habahamis, and there's the teva of the nefesh halikis. The word teva means very different things in these two cases. The teva of nefesh habahamis is klipa. The teva of nefesh halikis is l'mayla v'tava das. What is the teva of the nefesh habahamis? I talked about this last week. The teva, the nature of the animal soul, is that he doesn't want to do an aveda. I'll say that again. The nature of the animal soul is that he doesn't want to do an aveda. But taivas heter, permitted taivas, this he wants to have ad and shir. So the Rebbe says a person who indulges in taivas, he becomes cruder and coarser over time until Avedas are also something that he is vulnerable to. But the Nefesh HaBahamis is Teva, doesn't want to do an Aveda. The Rebbe has a Maimon where he says that by a Goy it's the same thing. The Teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis of a Goy is that he doesn't want to be over any one of the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neach. But like I said, over time he becomes insensitive to it. So that's Teva Nefesh HaBahamis. What's Teva Nefesh HaLakis? Teva, the neshama, a yid, nish der will, nish der kann, when August forget the chayt. A Jew neither wishes to nor is able to become separate maybe. So you have two tevas. The teva of Nefesh HaBahamis, that tevas het that yeah, tevas is a nish, and the teva of the Nefesh HaLakis, that he can become cut off from Hashem. The Rebbe says it's possible to use your nature to be a Beinani without any hisoidus, without any need to awaken. If you combine the Teva of Nefesh HaBahamis, you don't want to do any Avedis. With the Teva of Nefesh HaLakis, that you can't come up from Mebishni. Automatically, you're going to learn Torah and do mitzvahs and not do any Avedis with no inspiration because you're Le'avadim. Says the Rebbe, but if you choose to do 101, if you choose to do more, so you're pushing yourself. If you're pushing yourself, you need a motivation. If you need a motivation, you need an arousal. That makes it avodah. If I'm serving Hashem with the Teva of Nefesh HaLakis, the way it's hidden, I didn't do that. That the Eibishter did. But if I'm arousing my Teva of Nefesh HaLakis, I'm exciting myself by the Eibishter so that I can be able to do more than my Teva, more than 100, 101. That becomes avodah. And that's Rabbi said today's conversation. Today's conversation is how the person whose natural state is loyava, he learns and he davens, he doesn't have to struggle. He's loyava, there's no struggle in the Avodas Hashem. He's just doing the right thing without any exertion. He's doing the right thing because of the teva of the Nefesh HaLakis, and maybe on some level because of the teva of the Nefesh HaBahamis, but he's not inspired in himself. It's called loyava. He wants to do 101, now he has to push himself. I told you last week the Maise. It's a misnagdish Maise, but it's a good story. Forgive me for telling you a misnagdish Maise. I don't really mean forgive me, because if I shouldn't say it, I wouldn't tell it. Harav Yitzchak Hutner was against a misnagid. So here's the story. There was a kid, he's my father's age, who learned by Rabbi Hutner, who was a nephew of Rabbi Avram Karp from Montreal. This kid was an orphan, the Yossi. His parents paid tuition. He went to the yeshiva, they were more like a kid, he would learn the Torah, nobody yeshiva. His uncle, when he would come to the Rebbe, would go into him in Flatbush, and he would discuss with him how he's doing. And he would leave a few dollars. The money that he left was not schar, but it was something. He says, this man says to me, usually with the Rosh Yeshiva, would talk with Rabbi Karp, I would have to leave because they would fight like cats and dogs about the Rebbe and Babich and Freire. He says, I would stand outside and hear them screaming at each other. So he says, one time Rabbi Ram Karp came, and he left him a larger amount of money. So the Rosh Yeshiva says to him, I don't understand, you're a school teacher. You don't have a lot of money, how are you leaving such a large school? So he says, a Jew has to exert himself. And this got to him. So he says, this the nephew is saying, Rabbi Hutner hated formal events. He hated the events where people sit on a dais and people take turns giving drushes and you sit there and you shuckle and you try to stay awake. He hated it. And some Rebbe was opening up Sashtibel and he invited him to come be there by the Chanukas Abayis. He normally would have said no. But because of Avram Karpet gesagt, a Yid darf sich anstrengen, so he did it. But David Shingoff, there was a blizzard. There was this much snow. And he, every 10 minutes, was a nervous wreck. He was seeing if the Bachman dug out the car. He dug out the car, he went to this event, the whole time, he's sitting in the back seat, nervous wreck seat. He came back to the yeshiva, he goes up to this young butcher, he says, Altstein Schuld. What did he do? The guilt. He laid on the guilt, you understand? Rabbi Avraham Karp, noch a paar Dollar. So he took it, so he was so upset. He was so upset, but he did it. Bottom line is, he did it. A Yid darf sich did more than Yossi mit der Gelus. You're used to doing something 100 times, doing 101. Yossi mit der Gelus. So if you're doing more than your habit, you need a motivation. Now I want to pause here. I'm not going to give a long speech. I mean, all I'm doing is talking. Yeah, I haven't read a single word of text, but I'm going to give a short little hakdama, and then we're going to learn the pnim. Because I have to do this, otherwise you'll get confused. The Alter Rebbe is now going to say how the loy avode becomes avode vel ashtrei tzachon. The Beinani, who doesn't struggle for whatever reasons, is doing more than ashtrei tzachon. He's pushing himself past his natural limit, and because he's pushing himself past his natural limit, he has to excite himself, has to arouse in his heart feelings. So the Eibishter, in order to anstreng himself, to go beyond his limit. So what's going to happen here in these few lines is that Alter Rebbe is going to give two ideas. One idea is that he's going to awaken his neshama. The other idea, he's going to awaken his heart. You see, in Tanya, when they talk about moya shalat ala lev, using your mind to arouse your heart, there are two distinct concepts. One is, I'm using my mind to arouse my heart, but what's my heart? The fact that I naturally love Hashem. I'm a Jew. I naturally love Hashem, and I'm using my mind to express, to emote, to bring out those feelings. This is called in Tanya later, the chilu, the chimu tibim. Yiras Hashem and Avas Hashem based on Teva. And for the Mekubalah, for the Kabbalists keeping score at home, it's Elam HaYitzirim. Okay, this is such a concept. A Yid is using his mind to arouse his heart, but what is the meaning of the arousal of his heart? To arouse the Teva of a Yid to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's another concept of the Neshama. The second concept is a Yid is using his mind to create original feelings for the Eibishter, which are not part of the nature of the Neshama. This is called later in Tanya the Chilu or Chimu Sichliyim, Yiras Hashem and Avas Hashem based on Seichel. And this is the Madrega of El Mabriya. It's a higher level. True Moyach Shalt Alev is the second, not the first. The first one is called Moyach Shalt Alev, but it's really not, because you're not using your brain to create your emotions. You're using your brain to stoke a fire. You have a fire. You love Hashem b'teva. Your neshama loves Hashem by nature. You're simply revealing it. As opposed to the second, is where you're literally creating emotions because your brain is able to think about the Eibishter in ways that are outside of your tendency, outside of your personality, and you're developing a feeling of love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is coming from your heart and not from your personality. Now, as far as we're concerned, those two are the same. Whether a Jew is using his mind to arouse the nature of his emotion, which is called the chiru al-chimu tibim, or a Yid is using his mind to arouse original emotions, which is called the chiru al-chimu tibim, sichliyim, both of those are considered avodai. Why? A streng tzachon. A Yid has a streng, I'm stuck on the story, huh? A streng tzachon, a Yid is pushing himself beyond his limit. Specifically, the second is higher than the first. Using your mind to arouse the teva of your neshama is considered a lower level. Then using your mind to create original emotion, this is considered a higher level. And Alter Rebbe is going to say both. Alter Rebbe is going to say both. Okay? So unless somebody has a question or a comment, let's go to the text. Yes, ma'am, go ahead. But talk loud. I have to be able to hear you.
Other than Ava and Yira, what kind of emotions see arousing?
No, Ava and Yira, but there's different kinds of Ava and Yira. There's different types of Ava and Yira. There's an Ava and Yira which is based on the Teva, and there's the Ava and Yira based on the Seichel. In other words, without going into particulars, one person's Teva, we're talking about the Neshama here, but one person's Teva is Lamer Zogen, that he's mispal from nature. So think about the beauty of the Eibishter's world, the love Hashem. You start talking about spirituality, it doesn't work for him. Another person's the other way around. His nature is that he's mispal from Varim Ruchniyim. So if you're using the mind to arouse the natural emotions of love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but each person is going to be a different. His bond is based on that person's teva. You understand? Mash'enkin dechil sichli means you can think about something that you have no gishmak and no chush. If you're smart enough and you dedicate enough time, It'll excite you even though it's outside of your nature. That's why it's considered a higher madrega. This is Yetzirah, this is Bria. Okay? So we're starting on Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, that means page 41, near the bottom of the page. Okay? And let's start from Vilachay for 6 slides from the bottom. Like I said, this is one of those transitions which is not crisp. We read a little further from this last week. We're going back. We have to start somewhere. So we're starting Vilachay therefore. Zeis hapam hamei aviyachas. This 101st time, since this is Hayesera al Haragilus Shohur vel Minyura, which is more than the habit you've accustomed to from your youth. And again, we have 2 ways of explaining this. Way number 1, you're used to learning 100 times, and therefore 101 you're not used to, so this becomes hard. And way number 2, your nature is to learn 100 times. That's why you were born. But 101 is not in your nature. So this 101st time, Shkula keneged kula ve'el al gabeim, is as heavy as the whole 100 that came before, and even more than the 100 that came before. But yes, as ace, with more weight and more strength. This is what calls out of you. This is what defines you as being a person who's the madrega of a laborer for God, rather than layavade mipnei, because sheketei l'shanei steva regilus. When you have to change either your nature or your habit. You see, I'm mistranslating the words. Tava regilus is one noun, but I'm reading it as 2 things. Hateva oya regilus. The way you were born, or the way you change yourself into being a layavade. Says the Rebbe, tzarech la'eiden es ha'ava la'avayit. It is necessary to wake up Allah for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you can't wake up Allah for HaKadosh Baruch Hu through nothing. It requires Aidei Shem Mizbeinen. If the person contemplate, to think about the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu intellectually, so that you should affect Mayach Shalit Alalei. And I told you this a number of times. It says in the very first Maimon that Mayach Shalit Alalei is simply interpreted to mean the mind controls the heart. But it says in that Maimon, Mayach, the mind teaches the heart. And the 2 are not mutually exclusive. During davening, during the time of direct arousal, the mind is teaching the heart. And the rest of the day, that there's only a roshah, there's a trace of the Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem. From the davening, and then it's Takameach Shalat, the mind is controlling, dominating, suppressing the heart. So here we're talking Mayach Shalat Alev, not the mind controlling the heart, but the mind educating the heart. Because the person is now sitting down, or standing up, whatever the case may be, to do this bonanos, to do the contemplation necessary to arouse his emotion. But there's 2 types. And the Rebbe does the higher one first. In other words, the Rebbe does it the opposite of how I did it. Number 1. Al Yidei Shem is bein megdulos ad Hashem, a person is making the effort. Strengt sich on to contemplate the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'meicha in his mind, lishleit ala teva, to dominate his nature, shebechol ala smol, which is the left ventricle of the heart, hamol leidam nefesh habahamis, which is full of blood, which is the nefesh habahamis, top of page Chaf Aleph Beis, page 42. Shamei klipa, which comes from klipa. Shemei menu hu ateva, which is the source of this nature. So the blood, right? So sometimes it says, ki nefesh habasar badam hi. The soul is in the blood. And sometimes it says, hadam hu ha-nefesh, the blood is itself the nefesh. It's a contradiction. And the contradiction deserves resolution. And I don't know the resolution. And it's certainly not the yet the moment. But the bottom line is the blood and the nefesh are connected. And that's the behemoth. And the blood and the behemoth which are connected is not interested in the lakus. And you're arousing it, you're exciting it. That the person should be excited about the lakus rather than behamius. And therefore it's called Eved Elokim. And the Rebbe says, V'zuhi avedatam alabim. This is the highest kind of Beinoni. This is the optimum Beinoni, the highest kind of Beinoni. What is the highest kind of a Beinoni? I'm going to get back to this, by the way, when I finish teaching. The Pedic. Why is that Beinoni? Because this is talking about the Beinoni is using the mind. Not to arouse the nature of his neshama, the chilu, the chimu tivim, but to arouse original emotions out of the creation of his mind, which are called Bechiru, Lechimu, Sichlim, Yiras Hashem, and Avas Hashem, which is based on intellect, which is the Madrega Ve'elam Abriyim. Oi, and he continues. Or, alternatively, now comes the lower level. You're also waking up love. But you're waking up love, which you're not creating through your own effort. Hashem planted in the Yiddish in Neshama Avas Hashem, and you're simply triggering that Avas. This is called Bechilu, or Rechimu Tivim. Yiddish Hashem and Avas Hashem based on nature. So there's two things here. Until the Oi, which is the second line for top of page 42, we were talking about the Chilu, Rechimu, Sichlim, using the mind to arouse the original feelings like Kadosh Baruch Hu. And the Rebbe calls it Aved Tamal Lebeininim, who Kafisha is by as a comment. I'm going to go to this momentarily. And the second one is I'm using my mind to arouse the natural emotions, which is called the Chilu, Rechimu, Tivim. Lim Shel Al Yoda, to dominate using this natural love, Al Tevesh of B'chol Al Smali, over the nature of the next ventricle of the heart. And L'chayda, the kasha is, if I'm using my mind to arouse my natural emotions, Hashem gave me my nature. And if Hashem gave me my nature, and I'm simply revealing my nature, that should not be considered avodah. That should be considered lei avodah. Why? Because it's part of my nature. Says the Rebbe, no. Shazu nikra gam ken avodah. Simply awakening a natural love that the Eibush to put the mind in Neshama would be considered avodah. To quote, Ayid darf sich anstrengen, leilochem in mateva v'hayetzer, because he has to fight a war with his nature and with the Yetzer Hara. Ayidei shema oider ha'avim istesud, because he's awakening the love in his heart. What's the opposite of awakening? Mash'enkin, as opposed to tish'ein lemechama klal. If there's no war whatsoever with the animal soul, so then I read these two lines with you a couple of weeks ago. Ein ahav azu mitzad atzmi kasav. That's the call. If I'm a baby, because I love Hashem in my tava, but I'm not revealing that love, that's called le'avodah. But if I'm a baby, because I love Hashem in my tava, and I'm triggering the love, even though I'm triggering my natural love, my neshama love, and I'm not creating an original love, that constitutes avodah. So there's two ways that the Beinoni, who's called le'avodah, achieves what's called the meya p'amim ve'echad. He's going past his normal. He's going past his tava and his regilus. And he becomes oivet, as opposed to le'avodah. Number one, he's using his mind to arouse emotions that come from the brain. And number two, he's using his mind to arouse emotions that come from the teva. Okay, there's a lot of things that need to be said at this point, and I'll go about them with Hashem himself, one at a time. Number one, when you learn about Ava Mesoteres, the hidden love, usually we associate the Ava Mesoteres with Yechida. In Perikut chapter 18, Ava Mesoteres is Pintal Yechida, and I already told you many, many times that any time Ava Mesoteres comes up, the Alter Rebbe always says, B'Shem Kol Yisrael. We don't have Ava Mesoteres as individual Jews. We have Ava Mesoteres as part of Klal Yisrael, Tolos Yisrael, Tolos Neshamas, Perikut Gimel, Perikut Mamala, Perikut Ches, and so on. So Ava Mesoteres is normally associated with Yechida. Over here, Ava Mesoteres Amaisemit Yitzireh, which Kabbalistically is the Madrega of Ruach. It's a much lower level. I'm using my mind to arouse my natural love. So I love Hashem enough to push myself to do 101 times, just do 100 times, but it's not exactly Yechidah Shebenefesh. So, Bepashtes, there's two different Ava Mesoteres. The Ava Mesoteres is Perikut Ches, is Yechidah, Chochmah Shebenefesh. The Ava Mesoteres over here, this is Manage Ruach. And I believe that in the Rebbe's notes, he observes this. He points out that there's more than one idea in the Inyan that we call Ava Mesoteres. So alternatively, you could say it's the same Ava Mesoteres. The Pintal Yid law which a Yid has could be inside a level of Mesiras Nefesh. And it could be decided that I should love Hashem a little bit based on the arousal my mind brings to my heart. So I love Hashem enough to do Meya Pa'am V'achas 101 times, rather than only doing it 100 times, which is the Teva and the Gilus. So it's the same Ava, but it's being revealed to a lesser degree. That's my first vart. There's much more to say, but I'm going to give you a chance to make comments or ask questions. Someone has anything to say, ask a question, make a comment, and now's the time. Okay, so let me just continue. The end of Perek Tezvav is offering us a recipe for a Beinoni who's lo yavoda to become avodah. A human being whose conditioning is, either by nature or through habit, is that to do what he needs to do and not do what he mustn't do is become his nature, become his habit. No struggle. He has to push himself beyond his limits to become an avodah, yeah? And this requires arousal of the heart, which is why he's called oived. If he doesn't arouse his heart, he's called lo avodah. If he does arouse his heart, he is called avodah. But there's two ways, two levels. Number one, he's using his mind to arouse the nature of his HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which on the one hand is lower than seichel, on the other hand it's higher than seichel. And number two, he's using his mind to arouse original feelings of Hashem in his heart. And the Alter Rebbe finishes with the words, "V'zuhi aveidat tama lebeinu." This is the work of a bein that's called aveidat tama. Aveidat tama means God's. Tama means whole, perfect. There's no higher than this. This expression of aveidat tama, you have it more than one place in Chassidus, more than one place in Tanya, I believe. And it's based on Lashon Gemara. Aveidat tama is brought in the Gemara, the Lachas of Pigo and Zrika. There's something called a machshava psula. A person brings a carbon. If he has a bad thought, the carbon becomes puzzle. But he doesn't mean the Bible, it means the kohen. The host, the balabas, brings the carbon to the base of mikdash. His thoughts don't matter. The kohen's thoughts matter. And of course, the chiddush is, the lomdus is, the aha is that in this world only actions matter. Even words don't matter. Halacha is nothing real happens unless you do a ma'aseh b'peil, what we call a melacha of Shabbos. A melacha of Shabbos means a physical act that changes the world. Speech is not an action. It's not. And therefore, speech on Shabbos, it's a shvus. But it's also divrei Kabbalah. It's not a melacha. Speaking, even business, it's not a melacha. With one exception. When it comes to gavoy, when it comes to hektish, when it comes to karbonis, words are equal to actions. The chiddush, right? In my interactions, people do business. If you and I agree to buy and sell a car, it doesn't happen until we shake hands and make a kinyan. It has to be a mice. When it comes to karbonis, when it comes to kachim, amirasa legavaya, speech is like an action. And of course, the part where this becomes interesting is what's called koidim, nidorim. A person makes a vow. I promise that whatever the vow is. So it's called koinim, it's like a korban. Yehei, I like your korban. And then we say, le yachol dvorim. That a person made a neder that he's not going to eat sushi. From today until this evening, yeah? Makes a neder of derech Moshe. He says, koinim alai sushi, ad shkias achama. Yeah. He's not going to eat sushi till the sun sets today. So koinim is mashum korban. He's matzah b'davar anotu. That's what you do. You have to take something else which is already also. So their words are shot like an action. Nedarim, words are like an action because nedarim is even karma. But machshav is not. It's not. Right? If a person thinks they want to do something, there's no obligation. But in the Beis HaMikdash itself, the kohen makriv machshava is also mayil. The thought has to be a kavanah l'shem shamayim, otherwise this puzzle. And there's different kinds of machshavas psul. One of them is called machshavas chutz l'mkoymer, that the animal is going to be shechted or brought or eaten outside of the place. It becomes a machshavas psul. And then there's machshavas chutz l'zmanu, that it's going to be eaten at the wrong time. It's going to be mukrav at the wrong time. Chutz l'zmanu is called pigo. And for reasons that I don't know, chutz l'mkoymer is isen lav. Chutzlazman is a koris. If the kohen is thinking that the animal is going to be eaten outside the place it's supposed to be eaten, it's a lav. I mean, you can't give him malchus, he didn't do a maisa, but it's a lav. It's prohibition. It's a biblical prohibition. There's no punishment. If he thinks chutzlazmanoi, it's koris. That's one of the worst avedas. Why this is? It's gzeres hakos. That's the fact. Chutzlam kohen is one thing. Chutzlazman. But when it comes to pigul, there's another rule. The kohen has to admit. I mean, the kohen knows, the Eibishter knows. Yeah. The kohen knows, the Eibishter knows. Nobody else. There's one rule about pigul. That the psul of pigul is only if it's avodah tama. These two words. The two words. Zu avodah tama leben. One of the types of avodah tama, avodah she'ein acharei avodah. If a kohen is shechter, and b'shas the shechit he thinks machshav is chutz l'zmanei, it's not pigul. Because the rule of Pigot, I believe it's based on a pasuk, is only if it's the last avoid in a sequence. So when it comes to the blood, it's sprinkling the blood. The animal is shechted, the blood is collected, that's called Kabbalah. The blood is carried to the Mizbeach, that's called Heilocha. And the blood is sprinkled on the Mizbeach, however it's done, with the finger, and so forth, it's on the Mizbeach. With the Keli, with Matana. So the halachas of Pigul apply only by Zirik. Why? Because since after the Shechita, there's a Kabbalah. After Kabbalah, there's a Loch. But the other avodas, Machshavas Chutzes Mani, is not going to be Pigul. It's also the payment is today if the carbon is not kosher, but karas you don't know. And every single aspect of it, when it comes to the meat, so putting the meat on the mizbeach would be considered the machshav that's pegelis, the last step. You understand? And by oifis, by you do a malika, by an off, every single carbon, the same is true by menachas, every single carbon has steps. And the pigul, the machshavas chutzos mani, which is a karas applies by the last one. And the expression, the gemara will avoid the tamah. Avoid the tamah means it's metamemes, it ends the job. Ein acharei avodah. So the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov has this also in Kesef Shem Tov. I once gave classes on Kesef Shem Tov. I came across the same expression. I think Avodah the Tamah I'm in a second place in Tanya, and my brain doesn't work this morning. Medach it's in more than one place in Tanya. But the words are careful very chosen. Zui Avodah Tamah LeBeinani. This Beinani is Avodah Shein Acharav. You know what Alter Rebbe is saying? If this Avodah would be, this Beinani would be anything more than he is right now, he would be tzaddik. That's a touch. There's different kinds of beinanis, a lot of different beinanis. And there's a lot of different Avos Yiras Hashem, like you said before. This, as a Vedatamah, a beinani, higher than this is not a beinani anymore. This is the maximum avodah in the world of beinani. And there's a story. Stories are always good, right? Stories are always good. What's the story? The story is that the Rebbe Rashab went to a Levaya. The Rebbe Nishma Seidin went to a Levaya. Emes Lavek. And he came back from the Levaya. That's usually what happens, yeah? Ungavash in the hand. Never wash his hands. And he went into the Zal to say Yeshe B'Seiser. He went into the shul to say Yeshe. He didn't do it in his office. You know how Yeshe B'Seiser is? You're supposed to sit in separate different seats. You say Yeshe B'Seiser, Tula Pot Kim Alochav, Kim Alochav, Etzav Aloch, Lishmarcha, B'chol Dechecha, 7 words. So you sit down in your seat, you say Yeshe, you say Ki, and you make with your finger, you shouldn't forget. Then you move to the next seat, and you start again from the beginning. And you say Kim Aloch, then you go to a third seat. You're supposed to say Yeshe. Yeah? That's the minute. The Rebbe Rashab walked into the Zal, and the Bacham came into the Zal. I don't know if the Bacham were going to sit as the Rebbe was doing Yeshe B'Seiser, but he didn't stay into the Zal. He went into the Chabad Nitzah, the Cheder Sheni. The Cheder Sheni was the Bacham Dav Bariches. There were Bacham in that room davening that Beklal didn't know that there was a Levaya. The Beklal didn't know that Plady and Plady passed away. And they certainly did not know that the Rebbe himself was being Mishtatev in the Levaya. They were Ne'emus Hayenim. Tmimin, he talked to Lubavitch. One of the Bacharim was a chassid by the name of Reb Shilin Korat, Reb Shilin Disney. Reb Shilin. I told you this many times that the Rebbe Rashab said, mit Shilin und David hat dem Chepimim abgetalt dem ganzen Kern. 2 Bacharim paid the entire investment. Everything else is profit. That's what the Rebbe Rashab said. Mit Shilin and David abgetalt. Shilin and David were friends, and they were up. David is Kivman. David had a docket. Kivman is in Lubavitch. But unfortunately, Shilim's kinder, ich weiß nicht, San Lubavitch, Kuratin. Shilim and David, they were very different. David al-Adaki was an introvert. B'teva, he was a book person. He naturally concentrated. I talked to him about it in the last few weeks. Shmuel Batuma describes, he says, by David, the only difference between davening and learning is his eyes were open and his eyes were closed. Because concentration was natural for him. But Reb Shilim had ADD. Reb Shilim's nature was an extrovert. He was a monologue. He wasn't Gachpilkis. But he changed himself. He developed the greatest concentration of anybody about Reb Shilim. He gave back the chassidus that the Rebbe said verbatim. He was the chayzer. He changed his nature completely. The Rebbe Rashab walked into the Chabad Mitzvah, into the Cheder Sheni, and he sat down next to Reb Shilim. He was a bocher. He was wearing film, no talis. And he said, Yeshe B'Seiser. Reb Shilim didn't move. Lo yada v'shichva v'kuma. He got up, sat in front of him. He said, here. He made a kofe. I mean, if a person is sitting in a certain place, there are 8 places that you can sit around him. Yeah? 3 here, 3 here, 1 in front. The Rebbe didn't say Yeshiva B'Seisa. 9 times, he virtually circumnavigated him. After saying 7 times Yeshiva B'Seisa, and the Pshim didn't budge. His eyes were open. He didn't see that Rebbe. But the Rebbe Azogetan, V'zu hi aveda tam alabein. These words. And he got up and he left. In other words, a higher Beinani than this can't be. This is Beinani, but higher than this is Tzaddik. When the Pshilin finished davening, somebody made the mistake of telling him what the Rebbe said. And he was very, very unhappy. He says, now we got to deal with the guy in the Yeshes. If I wouldn't know, it wouldn't bother me. This is his reaction. Now I got to deal with the guy in the Yeshes. Aveda Tamal Beinani means the optimum Beinani. And there's 2 things you have to know about the optimum Beinani. You should know this is a segue to the next Perek. Perek Tezayin almost reads like one Perek with Tezvov. This is a segue to next week. And I'm probably going to repeat the whole thing Nachamo. Next week is just Kislev. I don't know what my schedule is going to be yet, 100%. But next week is Chav Kislev. Shabbos is Kislev. Rosh Hashanah L'Chasidus. That the optimum Beinani has 2 rules. Rule number 1, that he's using the mind to arouse his heart, not the nature of love of Hashem in his heart, but original feelings of love. The chilu, rechibu, sichlim. He's arousing feelings for love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which are not based on his nature of his neshama, but they're a bunch of original emotions which he's arousing through use of his mind. That's number 1. Number 2, that it's fully revealed. That he's actually experiencing Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem in a pronounced, in an emotional way, like the Rebbe said once. What's the meaning of Avas Hashem? That you love the Eibush so much that your heart beats quicker, that the heart's clapped. Schneller. That's a physical action. What's the physical act of loving HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That your heart rate is accelerated. So those 2 points, that the emotions that you're arousing are coming from the mind and not from the soul, because the soul the Eibush gave. And that the emotional arousal which is coming from the mind is fully manifest, it's fully expressed in passion. These 2 things make it Aveda Tamal Beinani. Okay? So we finished more or less Perek Tezvav. Yes, ma'am, you wanted to say something.
It had to do with the pickle. It's not so much with the Tanya. I was always curious. I didn't understand. Because the idea of pickle, it has to be an intentional machshava zara, right? It's not like mindlessness that you weren't thinking. Right. Mindlessness I can understand. What kaili, but for what reason would he have an intentional thought to cause it to be pickle?
Okay, that's the kasha. You know, we're learning chitas, yeah? Where are we holding in Tanya?
The end. Page Kuf Sama.
We're holding pigel. We're holding pigel. What does the Alter Rebbe say about pigel? The lei shchichi klau. These things don't happen. Everybody says, I'm going to state this in Teire. And the Rebbe is masbir. Because every Gashmi is like a klipa, has a ruchni, is like a shelish. And when you learn Hilchas Pigel, and he gives the example of a person who thinks Asiri, Chia, Asiri, you're doing Maisa Behema, and you make a mistake with the numbers, and you call the 9th the 10th, the 10th the 9th, the 11th the 10th, the 10th the 11th, the Chmeiz Vos. These things are not happening. But they're dinim and teresh b'ksav, and they're dinim and teresh b'peh. And when you learn these halachas, you're mevared a klipa. If it happens physically, you mevared the klipa physically. If it never is going to happen, the klipa, the way it is in the shadish, it becomes mavured when you learn the halachas of people. Okay, let's take a break and we'll do a yem yem. Thank you for all coming and listening.